Welcome to Murder Mile. Today, I'm standing on Finborugh Road in Fulham, SW10. 3 streets southwest of the beating of Gunter Padola. A tube stop south of John George Haig's bubbling drum. 2 doors down from the woman in red. And 1 street east of the lynching of the last fighter. Coming soon to Murder Mile. Opposite Brompton Cemetery sits 13 Finborugh Road. 1 of 10 5-storey Victorian terraces in a block, with fake Doric columns around the door and its stucco painted white, as if the house was hand-chiselled from marble, like a Greek god's buttocks, flexing majestically as if to lure the inhabitants of Lesbos. The last time I stood here, a man living in the flat where the woman in red's body smashed onto the steps below glared at me as I told his grinning neighbour about the murder in his flat. And although a hint of one-upmanship permeated her lips, today, sorry missus, but your house is equally as bloody. The basement flat was the home of 25-year-old Gertrude Yates, a high-class call girl who was smart, well-liked and polite. Her preferred clients were titled gentlemen and men of rank, who could treat her to the finer things in life that she felt that she deserved. But on the morning of Monday the 6th of March 1922, Gertrude was found beaten, gagged and strangled by her latest client, an army major called Ronald True. But who had really murdered her? Was it Ronald True? Or was it the other Ronald True? My name is Michael. I'm your tour guide. And this is Murder Mile. Episode 255. The other Ronald True. Gertrude's life was as typical as many women in that era. Born in August 1896, Gertrude Yates was the daughter of Lillian and Lionel Yates, a working-class family who struggled, as with her father being a commercial traveller. He schlepped from door to door and city to city, selling pots, pans and bog brushes to the masses, for the sake of a few pennies to feed his ragged family. In 1904, aged 8, her father died. So being the sole breadwinner, against her wishes, Gertrude was sent to the Royal Commercial Travellers' School in Pinner for the next 8 years. Away from her mother and her brother, she was taught supposedly useful skills for a young lady, like sewing, cleaning and cooking. In 1912, age 16, Gertrude came to London to find work. Being a girl who had nothing, but dreamed of a better life full of life's finest, she knew that her only chance of success was by hope, luck and hard work. Rising from the invisible rank of a floor sweeper to the slightly loftier heights of an apprentice draper and a seamstress, it was in the fashionable workshop of Bradley & Coy in Westbourne Grove that Gertrude learned her trade. But she also developed an expensive taste for silk, laces and the latest fine fashions. But as the First World War had confiscated every material for the fight, her career was finished, and all she was left with was her looks. Gertrude wasn't a prostitute as such. As a call girl, she was more of a paid companion to a host of moneyed men with titles and ranks, who could treat her to a meal at Claridge's, a show at the Palladium, a gift from Harrods, and being whizzed back to a bijou pied-à-terre at 13A Finborugh Road in a chauffeur-driven car. She would satisfy the desires of a handsome young man in return for an agreed price, a weekly allowance, and another date bobbed in the diary. Gertrude, who with 4 convictions for soliciting was known to the West End police as Olive Young, wasn't a snob. But she didn't hobnob with the riffraff, as having come from nothing, she knew that her only way of escaping the life she had no intention of ever returning to was through the wealthy. All of her clients were well off, and that included Ronald True. Sort of. Born on the 16th of June 1891 in Chiltern-on-Medlock in Manchester, Ronald also came from nothing, being the illegitimate son of Annabel Angus, the 16-year-old daughter of a Scottish innkeeper. Her life was a struggle, having recently got divorced, until their lives were changed forever by a fairy tale romance. In 1912, when Ronald was just 11, his mother married Arthur Reginald French, the 5th Baron de Frame. As an aristocrat who lived in a grand terrace at 1 Green Street in Mayfair, just beside the Ritz, their marriage made her Lady Annabel de Frame. And with him being childless, Ronald was raised by the Baron as his own child. In Ronald's eyes, his stepfather was his hero, and rightfully so. Having lived his early years as an officer in the Northwest Mounted Police, a private in the 8th Infantry Regiment at Slocum in Texas, and later as a captain of the 3rd Battalion of the Southwest Borderers. So in awe was Ronald that he often claimed his stepfather's exploits as his own. In truth, Ronald wasn't a well boy, with many even suggesting that his mental illnesses may have stemmed from before he was born. At school, his attendance was poor, his behaviour was bad, and lacking any love. When told that his mother was dying, he callously replied,
"Oh well, if she dies, all her property will be mine."
He rarely worked, he was promiscuous, and growing addicted to morphine in Shanghai. His mind was always unstable. In August 1915, with the First World War having soaked the fields of France with the blood of millions of men, being the epitome of an aviator, 6'2", slim, sweatback hair, a natty moustache, and a cut-glass accent which purred,
"I say, old bean, what?
Using his stepfather's career, Ronald enlisted in the Royal Flying Corps. Being the son of a baron, they didn't check his history as having taken it on a gentleman's word. On the 10th of October 1960, he was given a commission as a flying officer. Being the early days of aviation, it wasn't uncommon for a trainer, whether an Airco DH-6 or a Bristol box kite, to crash owing to pilot error or malfunction. And although Ronald was assigned to the 40 and 45 squadrons, he never had a dogfight, being listed as a substandard pilot. In February 1916, He said that during his first solo flight, he crashed in Farnborough. Pulled from the burning wreckage, he suffered severe concussion and was unconscious for 2 days. The next month, having also crashed at Gosport, escaping with just cuts and bruises, a medical board certified him as unfit to fly. Hospitalised for 10 months, he'd later claim,
"I relinquished my commission as a major owing to my crash injuries."
But little of what he said was even true. The limp to his right leg he'd actually had before the crash. The brain contusion was said by doctors to have been caused by gonorrhea and syphilis. The Flying Corps would declare,
"He was never a major, just a second lieutenant."
And of his heroics, having seen active service overseas, these were entirely a figment of his imagination, just like the accidents. As his military record states,
"There are no record of any crashes."
In 1917, bafflingly hired as a test pilot at Westland, again on a gentleman's word. This time having actually crashed and shattered his teeth. After just 2 months he was sacked, owing to his bad moods and poor performance. From that point on, no one would hire Ronald, as the diseases he'd contracted, as well as spread in many Shanghai brothels, had left him physically lame and mentally unwell, suffering bouts of depression, mania, psychosis and dementia. All of which he was prescribed with a single dose a day of morphine. Only he was taking as many as 30. Having abandoned his wife and child, with a lethal mix of STDs and morphine increasing his paranoia, at an addiction centre in Southsea, Ronald was diagnosed with a dissociative identity disorder. This was also where he met the other Ronald True. The other Ronald True was his doppelganger. A slim, tall man with a hawkish nose and beady little eyes, who stalked his thoughts and whispered into his ears. Seeing this sinister clone as his mortal enemy, the other Ronald True was a drug addict, a sex fiend, and a habitual conman who survived on theft and forged checks. And although Ronald would often be blamed for his lookalikes' crimes, he was insistent.
"I am innocent."
In December 1921, while staying at Fleming's Hotel on Half Moon Street in Piccadilly, again, the other Ronald True racked up debts and fled without paying, as his armed and dangerous duplicate shadowed him across Soho and Mayfair. So terrified was Ronald of his stalker that for his protection, he bought a gun. But how could he defend himself from a monster who only seemed to exist in his head? The relationship between Ronald and Gertrude was as fleeting as any meet-up between a call girl and a punter. 6 weeks earlier, in an exclusive West End lounge, Olive Young, as she was known, met Major Ronald True, the dashing war hero, a test pilot, and a baron's son, who he said had been invalided out of the prestigious Royal Flying Corps, owing to his heroism, having fought in dogfights with the Hun. On Saturday the 18th of February 1922, having agreed to go on a date with the Major, as was standard, he treated her to a meal a show, and chauffeur-driven back to 13A Finborugh Road. He stayed over. The two chatted, they had sex, and then they slept. By the morning, the Major had fled. He had left without paying. But it was as she opened her handbag, which she'd left beside the bed, that she spotted that £5 was missing. Gertrude couldn't prove it, but having told her friend Doris Dent, "I want nothing to do with him," the relationship was over. Or at least, it should have been. For many people in the 1920s, the loss of £5, roughly £400 today, would have had consequences on their daily life. But for Gertrude, being a professional woman who could make that money back in a single evening, it was little more than a mild inconvenience. So having not told the police, she carried on with her life. To her, Major Ronald True was as forgotten as a piece of chewing gum stuck on the sole of her shoe. But with him being a disturbed man with odd obsessions, he loved her as much as he loved her money. Over the next 2 weeks, Gertrude received a series of unnerving phone calls from a Mr. Armstrong, who pestered her for dates, only to then cancel. Telling her friend Doris Dent, "I feel convinced it was Major True," as having broken his jaw in a crash. "I recognised his voice." She also stated she was afraid to meet him in the flat, as he admired my rings and jewellery, and I was sure he'd steal them. Of course, Major True would deny all of this, blaming it all on his alter ego, the other Ronald True. Seeing himself as too regal to ride on a bus with all of the plebs. On Thursday the 2nd of March 1922, again on credit, and again on a gentleman's word, because it was believed that a gentleman would never lie, he hired a Rolls Royce with the chauffeur Luigi Mazzola to be at his beck and call, day or night. That night, claiming, "I have a lot of business to attend to. Drive me as fast as you can," he was whizzed across the West End, picking up a Mr. Armstrong, a man who Ronald had known for barely a month, only then to be sped to a junction of Finborugh Road, at which Ronald returned, saying, "There is nobody there." The next day was the same. Having raced from Piccadilly to Croydon to Maidenhead, and having been let out again on the corner of Finborugh Road, once again with "no one was in," he requested a quick stop at a nearby coffee shop, only to return to the same flat on the same street, and then return dejected. By the morning of Saturday the 4th of March, looking red-eyed and stiff-jawed, again he was driven from place to place with no real reason, as if he was seeking someone who wasn't there, hunting a human who didn't wish to be found, or biding his time until the object of his obsession was home. Gertrude wasn't in, and for good reason, as knowing that he was seeking her, she'd made herself scarce even cancelling her dates with her usual clients in her regular haunts. Sunday the 5th of March 1922 began as an ordinary day for Gertrude Yates. At 9 a.m, Emily Steele, her maid for the last 2 years, descended the stone steps and let herself into the basement flat at 13 Finborugh Road with her own key. Entering the long hallway, she heard no sounds of sleeping or stirring, as by the door lay her mistress's shoes. To the right were 2 doors. The first was the sitting room, all empty and clean, except for 2 glasses and the ash of a stranger's cigarette. Although, given Gertrude's profession, almost every guest was a stranger. The second was the bedroom. With the curtains closed, through the frosted glass pane on the door, the room inside was black, silent and still. So not wanting to wake her, Emily crept by, unworried and calm. As she always did, in the back scullery, she popped on a fresh pot of tea, slathered the toast with lashings of salted butter. She let the sausages sizzle until golden brown, and portioning it onto 2 plates, one for herself, which her mistress allowed. On a tray, she took Gertrude's breakfast to the bedroom.
Madam! Madam! Breakfast! Madam?
And then she heard it.
Oh, morning, Emily.
As alone, snuggled in her bed, lay Gertrude.
Breakfast, madam.
As the curtains were opened, and the radio popped on. That morning was as predictable as any other, during which she read a book, darned some socks, made some calls, and prettied herself ready for her evening's work as Emily cleaned the flat. She could see that Gertrude was tense, as with Major True having called to say that he planned to meet her here at 10 p.m. She had every intention to be elsewhere, far from his cold glaring eyes and his sticky little fingers. At 3:30 p.m, Emily left. At 5 p.m, Gertrude called Doris Dent, and stating, "I don't want to see him," they made plans to meet in Piccadilly, where they chatted, ate, drank, and occupied her troubled mind. But she couldn't stay there forever. So having parted at 10:30 p.m, she would arrive back by 11 p.m. After 5 stops on the Piccadilly line to Earl's Court, and an 18-minute walk, on the corner of Redcliffe Place and Finborugh Road, her heart sank and her throat gulped as she spotted a Rolls-Royce waiting.
Major True?
Yes, 'tis I,
said the looming presence on her stone steps. Said to be a woman of sober habits, not quarrelsome, just good-tempered. She wouldn't have made a scene. She would have been polite. She'd have apologized for being late. And having agreed to let him in, he told his driver,
I'm going to stay the night.
And with the chauffeur-driven car speeding away into the dark, Gertrude was left alone in the empty flat with either Ronald True or the other Ronald True. She locked the door using a key. She removed her shoes and placed them in a hall. In the sitting room they had a drink, and wanting to make this as normal as possible, she took him to the bedroom. A little later than usual, Emily arrived.
I got there at 9:15 a.m. I let myself in. I noticed a gentleman's coat and a blue and red scarf in the sitting room.
Which wasn't unusual. So knowing that a guest was in the bedroom,
I went to cook breakfast.
with no intention of disturbing her mistress. It was then that the bedroom door opened, and as often happened, she saw a man. Emily said,
Oh, hello again.
The Major greeted her. They chatted. She made him a tea. And having said,
We were late last night. Don't wake her. She's in a deep sleep.
he gave her the 2 shillings and 5 he owed her for a taxi. She helped him on with his coat. And at 9:35 a.m, he left her with a pleasant,
Toodle pip.
with Madam's breakfast on the warming plate. Emily spent half an hour sprucing up the sitting room. But knowing that her mistress had plans for that morning, she decided to wake her from her slumber.
Madam! Madam! Breakfast!
But noticing a crack in the frosted glass panel,
Madam?
the investigation was headed up by Detective Chief Inspector William Brown. The hallway, the sitting room, the scullery and the WC were all neat and clean before Emily had even done her daily chores, with no signs of any forced entry, ransacking, wanton destruction or obvious theft. The cracked glass pane was the first clue that something was wrong. Inside the bedroom, cupboards were open, drawers were rummaged, and its contents strewn. Missing was a silver cigarette case, a silver lady's wristwatch, a pearl and diamond brooch, and 2 diamond rings, as well as a red jewel case and £8 from her purse. In total, £200 worth was missing, roughly £9,500 today. The evidence told an odd little story. At roughly 8:30 a.m, Gertrude's guest had left to purchase a copy of the Daily Mirror. He returned, made a pot of tea, popped it on a tray with a selection of biscuits and 2 cups, and re-entered the bedroom. Lying silently, the mistress was resting when he came in. Therefore, she was totally unaware that he had hidden inside of his overcoat a half-kilo rolling pin from the scullery. Attacked before she could sense any danger, 5 times he bludgeoned her over the head, rendering her barely conscious, but far from dead. With her skull badly bleeding, but not fractured, seeing her limbs move, he wrapped her own girdle around her neck, and with the elastic straps tied tightly in a half-loop knot, he strangled her until she went limp. In the bed, the form of her body remained, all silent and still. But as the detectives pulled back the blood-stained sheets, the woman was missing. In her place, the killer had laid 2 pillows lengthways. Only a red sticky trail from the bed to the bathroom told a much darker tale. Dragged 11 feet, with the naked woman still clinging to life, the last thing she would have seen was as he forced a towel so far down her throat that it folded her tongue back in on itself, obstructing her fractured trachea and starving her of life. And then, with death done, he casually tossed a pajama jacket over her face. And having died minutes before Emily had arrived, over the next half hour, he sat quietly supping his tea and eating the biscuits. By 10 a.m, the culprit was gone. Only it wasn't hard to identify him, as his fingerprints were on the cup, and although Emily had said that he was a major, in the sitting room he had also left a visiting card in the name of Ronald True. Like a callous coward, having brutally murdered a sleeping woman, he sold off her jewellery at a pawnbroker's, took himself on a shopping trip in the West End, and he treated himself to all manner of finery. A haircut on Wardour Street, a new suit and a bowler hat from Horn Brothers, a spot of lunch, a few drinks, and having packaged up his blood-stained trousers and left his stained shirt and tie at the barber's, he took himself and his pal, Mr. Armstrong, to the Hammersmith Palais of Varieties in the Rolls-Royce. With all the receipts leading directly to his seat, at 9:45 p.m. that day, he was arrested. An ID parade, eyewitnesses, and a wealth of evidence convicted Ronald True on the 5th of May 1922 during a trial at the Old Bailey. With the solicitors pleading diminished responsibility, owing to various mental illnesses and a spiralling morphine addiction, with Ronald's defence being that it wasn't him who had murdered Gertrude Yates, but his doppelganger, the other Ronald True. Insanity was proven. Being sentenced to death, an appeal was passed, and it was recommended that he be imprisoned for life in a high-security psychiatric hospital. Sent to Broadmoor, he was weaned off drugs. He lived an ordinary life as an inmate, and on the 8th of January 1951, at the age of 59, he died of a heart attack. Unlike at many trials, his claim that a clone was stalking him and committing crimes on his behalf was not an alibi or an excuse to escape the death penalty, as he truly believed that the other Ronald True was guilty. Even in his confession, he would state,
I think it fair to state that a man whose description is age 31, 6'2", dark suit, grey overcoat and a bowler hat,
identical to him,
was seen by myself with Miss Yates. I left, and they were in the midst of a violent argument and blows. I confirm this statement is true.
And it was true. In his mind, it was true. That he was an innocent man, wrongly convicted of a crime he didn't commit. But with the culprit looking exactly like him, sounding precisely like him, and their fingerprints indistinguishable, how could he prove any different when everyone was certain it was him? In his mind, the other Ronald True had got away with murder. Only he would also claim that there wasn't just one other Ronald True. There were two.